Hello, welcome back. Once again, this is your instructor, Vernon Creviston. This is an intro video for our next Foner textbook chapter, Chapter 18, The Progressive Era. Now, in this particular chapter of the Foner textbook, we're really going to kind of look at this change in American mentality that occurs in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when more and more Americans start kind of questioning the idea of social Darwinism and laissez-faire capitalism, when they start seeing a lot of these issues that we already know exist start confronting them personally, and they have to deal with it. And the way they deal with it is kind of an interesting blend of activism and just personal action, if you will. So binding together in groups, activism, but also just going out and kind of taking on these challenges one at a time wherever they live. So very personal in a lot of ways, but also a lot of group activities. And because there's so much of this activity that happens in this period, it is called the Progressive Era, when these Americans kind of bind together and say, what can we do to make this a better country, a better place to live, a better place for us to live in? And they do make a lot of changes. They do kind of go against this grain of social Darwinism, of go it alone, do it on your own, do your own thing, leave companies alone to do whatever they want. That's the way the system's supposed to work. Well, these new people in the early 20th century start challenging those notions, saying you can't just let anybody do whatever they want, that's not good for the greater good, for the most people. So they start putting a lot of checks and balances, a lot of limitations on what corporations and even some individuals can do. And when you kind of look at this entire period, that's called the Progressive Era. That's what historians have labeled it, is this period of change, of kind of trying to make the country a better place, to give the country a new era of progress, making it better. That's what a lot of these people are interested in, is improving their country, not tearing everything up and destroying it. They still believe in individual achievement. They still believe in people doing their own thing and getting ahead in life. That they don't want to stop, but they do want to make sure it's a little bit more fair. It's a level playing field, if you will. That's what their idea of progress is, to keep improving the nation and making it a better place. And there's a lot of things that they have to look at. These progressives start kind of feeling they need to deal with these problems, that there are a lot of issues out there, that there are a lot of companies that are acting badly, that there are companies that are taking advantage of their customers, that are selling them shoddy, poor product, and there's nothing that they can do about it. So you don't really want to say that this is a reactionary movement entirely, that really what they're trying to do is modernize the country, that they feel that a lot of the economy, a lot of the social institutions just can't meet a lot of the new challenges that exist. So they want to go out and fix those things, kind of put some limits, make companies do the right thing, make companies more responsible. Take care of, if it's a bad company, if it's doing bad practices, find a way to punish it. If their cities are dirty, find a way to clean them up. So there's a lot of activism going on here. A lot of people that want to deal with these problems that they've really known they were there the whole time, but they've just kind of ignored up till now as the country has grown by leaps and bounds. But now they're getting to the point where they just can't ignore the pollution anymore. They can't ignore bad business practices anymore. They can't ignore the poverty that they see in their cities. They have to fix those problems. And what they do is they start going to professionals. They start going to different businesses and saying, hey, how can we make this better? How can we improve things? How can we check the power of some of these corporations and make it a more level playing field for all of us? So they start becoming active. They start organizing themselves into groups, based on their particular areas of interest, with the particular things they want to see, whether it be cleaning up a city, limiting the power and influence of a corporation, fixing the morality of Americans, making them better people, if you will, by limiting their access to things like alcohol, which some progressives saw as kind of the bane of the working man, that working people spent too much money on alcohol, and because of that, their families suffered, which meant all of us suffered because that put more criminals on the streets, more children without families to support them. So there's a lot going on in this period. There's a lot of things that they're interested in fixing. We'll also see that there are some limitations to this, that there are certain things that these progressives aren't interested in fixing. But they are going to get out there and do quite a bit. And they're going to come from a lot of different segments of American life. Now, that's kind of the interesting thing about this particular. Now, one of the things that kind of leads to some impetus in this particular period, the Progressive Era, are journalists that really kind of get out there and bring home these big issues that people kind of know they're out there, but they kind of find a way to avoid. Well, journalists like people like Jacob Riis, who's shown here in the photograph in the upper right, a Danish immigrant, somebody that came to the United States with, grand ideas of becoming a, rich and successful person in the United States. Well, he came here to the United States in the 1890s, the 1880s, I want to say, with $40 in his pocket, which quickly ran out. And very soon he was confronted with the fact that he had no money, no place to live, no food to eat, and he was so despondent that at one point he was almost ready to kill himself. That's how bad things had gotten for him. But slowly but surely he found a job, started to make some money, found a place to live, put his life back into order. But while those few first struggling years, he learned that there's an entirely different America out there than what most people knew. And as technology developed, new cameras and new camera techniques, things like flash photography started to kind of be pronounced and be produced in the United States. He used that technology to bring the things that he saw during his experience as a young immigrant to the United States to more and more Americans, especially those Americans of the middle class and upper class who had fled the cities, lived on the outskirts of the cities now, and really just didn't see how people were living in these factory towns and in this new industrial society that existed. Being a European, Jacob Riis was really influenced by writers like Charles Dickens, whose books like Oliver Twist, even A Christmas Carol, kind of pointed out just how some people were doing really well in this period, but a vast majority of people weren't. Well, Jacob Riis and his pictures were put into a book called How the Other Half Lives that tried to point out to a lot of Americans, especially middle class and upper class Americans, that the lives that they led were vastly different from most of the people that they shared a city with. As you can see in these photographs on the bottom, Jacob Riis pointed out that a lot of children were orphans living on the streets. There was no place for them to go, no orphanages, nobody to take care of them, that they just existed out there and basically became like packs of animals running around, stealing, causing problems because they needed money and had nothing to do with their time. They weren't going to school. There were some public schools, but they weren't being forced to go to them, so they would live out on the streets. Other times he showed the wretched conditions of the tenements, the places where industrial workers would live or immigrants would come to live. Sometimes packing as many as 8 or 10 people into a room designed for 1 or 2 persons. Places without any running water, without any toilet facilities, right? Places where garbage just piled up because there was no garbage service. So imagine that. New York City, a city of 4 million people at the time, that is essentially the size of Manhattan Island plus a few other boroughs right around the water's edge there, has 4 million people packed into an area that now is 3 times as large as it was then. And it has no garbage or sewer facilities. Can you imagine living in a city like that? All those people piled on top of each other without any running water, without any sewer facilities, right? Human waste just laying everywhere, garbage just laying everywhere in these poorer parts of New York. His book, How the Other Half Lives, shocked a lot of people, including a young police commissioner by the name of Theodore Roosevelt, who was an up-and-coming politician in the Republican Party in New York and came from a wealthy New York family that had been in the New York area for almost 150 years, since when it was a Dutch colony, actually. And Theodore Roosevelt came to Jacob Riis after he put out his book and said, what can I do to help? What can we do to make this a better city where we can take care of some of these problems and make it a safer and more enjoyable place to live? And that's kind of what's happening here, right? That's what progressivism is about, fixing these problems and making this a better place for all of us to live in. And it wasn't just on these social issues or these issues of the tenements and the poor living conditions of Americans in this industrial society. Other of these journalists, kind of these activist journalists, people like Ida Tarbell, started pointing out that companies themselves, these big corporations that were being created and made people fabulously wealthy, like Rockefeller Standard Oil or Carnegie Steel Company, were really, really taking advantage of the system, that they were really becoming dominant players in American society. She pointed out in her book on Standard Oil, The Octopus, that this company literally had its hands in all facets of American life. It controlled politicians and made them pass laws that were beneficial to it over its competitors. It controlled shipping areas. It dictated how much people got charged to ship things, Rockefeller Standard Oil Company had more power than the federal government, and indeed it actually controlled a lot of the federal government. Well, actually not all parts, because if you notice down here in the lower right or lower left-hand corner of this photograph, there's still one part of the federal government that seemed to kind of be out of reach to these big corporations, and that's the White House. And at this particular time when these things are happening, there was somebody in the White House, that young police commissioner from New York, Theodore Roosevelt, who identified with this progressive cause, right, this fixing of America. And he's going to kind of lead the charge in a lot of ways to making changes in the system, to fixing a lot of these problems. But these journalists, muckrakers as they were called at the time, that was kind of the name given to a lot of these people that wrote about these social problems, these economic issues in American life. They could actually comment on a lot of different things. Lincoln Steffens was a journalist for McClure's Magazine, and he wrote a number of articles talking about the political corruption that happened in the United States. And the company he worked for, McClure's Magazine, was probably one of the most read late 19th and early 20th century publications in the United States. Virtually every middle-class or upper-class household would read that magazine. So he had an incredible amount of influence, and he pointed out to a lot of these people that what they wanted done often wasn't done because businesses or corrupt politicians kept their wishes from actually happening. He pointed out to those people, that their votes really didn't matter. Even though they went out and voted in droves and said, we want something, it didn't happen because these other interests were arrayed against them and kept it from happening, even though legally it should be. They should be cleaning up cities. They should be changing laws to make it harder for these companies to do these bad business practices. And Steffens pointed out that even though people seemed to want one thing, politicians were making something else happen. In other areas, other writers like Upton Sinclair pointed out just how bad some of these companies were acting and how they just didn't care about their customers. Remember, in social Darwinism, bad companies are supposed to go out of business, right? When they give a bad product, people are supposed to say, oh, that's horrible. We're not going to buy your stuff. We're going to buy somebody else's who's better. Well, Sinclair pointed out that a lot of times you didn't know they were doing something bad to you, or these bad companies bought out other companies and forced you to buy their inferior product. In his particular book, The Jungle, he pointed out how meat packers in Chicago really didn't give you meat. They gave you sawdust, rat droppings, really kind of horrible, gangrenous meat, and then sold it to you. And often these products would kill you. Sometimes the bad meat was already spoiled. You opened up your can of meat and got sick from eating it. Right? So a lot of these progressives are starting to kind of trying to show Americans that they can't just sit back and wait for these companies to fix things on their own, because they're not going to. And you can't count on government officials to do it because they're in the pockets of these corporations, or they just don't have any interest in fixing these problems. That if you're going to fix these problems, you have to do it yourself. So it's kind of a call to action, if you will. And even though a lot of progressives, people like the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, don't particularly like Upton Sinclair or Lincoln Steffens, they feel they're troublemakers. That's why they give them the name muckrakers, that they're out there just causing trouble, stirring up issues. They still have to agree that there is an issue, that these muckrakers are bringing up some good points, things that do need to be taken care of. And that's how it happens in the early 1900s. Now, in the 1900 campaign, William McKinley runs for re-election after the very successful war with Spain, where the United States actually puts together its empire with its overseas possessions, places like Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico. Well, in 1900, William McKinley decides that he needs a little boost to make sure that the Democratic opponents have no chance in this election. So he goes out and gets the very, very popular Theodore Roosevelt, one of the heroes of the Mexican-American, or of the Spanish-American War, for his charge up San Juan Hill, one of those celebrities created by the war. And he puts Theodore Roosevelt on the ticket, just to kind of boost his popularity, if you will, kind of through a surrogate Theodore Roosevelt. Now, McKinley really didn't have any worries about re-election, but he just wanted to kind of show that he was in touch with what was happening, that he had a popular running mate, just to kind of make sure that he didn't have to worry at all about his re-election. And it works. McKinley wins in a landslide. The only problem is, not long after he does his second inauguration in March of 1901, he is killed by an anarchist at a public speaking arrangement, And that leaves this young, brash New Yorker, Theodore Roosevelt, that's really kind of dabbled in a lot of things, is now President of the United States, and he was never meant to be. And once he gets into office, you find that he is very much one of these progressives. Now, the interesting thing about Theodore Roosevelt is he kind of encapsulates the entire 19th century and early 20th century America. He's into everything. He's an intellectual. He writes books. He's a Renaissance man in a lot of ways. There's really nothing he can't do. He's an outdoorsman. He had a cattle business out west, right? So he's kind of done everything, if you will. But as President of the United States, he really does identify with this progressive agenda of fixing the United States. And once he gets into office, he quickly shows that he's going to be a little different. In 1902, there's a coal miners' strike. Coal miners say, we're not going to work for less wages, and you can't break our unions, we're going to go on strike. Business leaders turn to the federal government saying, force these workers back in to the mines or chase them off so we can hire new workers. Theodore Roosevelt does exactly the opposite of what every other president has done, which is back the owners of these mines. He turns around and says, no, you need to come here and talk fairly and work out a deal with these miners. It is too important a business. Coal is the backbone of the American economy, and we need it to be settled. We need you to settle your differences. Come here to the White House, and I will be the go-between. I'll be the arbitrator. I will help you work out your differences. The mine workers quickly accept this deal, say, hey, that's great with us. We just want to work out a fair deal. The mine owners say, no, we're not interested in that at all. Theodore Roosevelt comes back and says, not to the mine workers that he's against them, but to the mine owners, telling them that I'm going to call out the troops all right, but not to force the miners back into the mines, but to take over your mines and allow the workers to work for the federal government. Well, those mine owners quickly capitulate. They quickly work out a deal with the mine workers union and start reopening the mines. And it really does show this big shift that's happening in the United States, that even the President of the United States realizes it can't be business as usual anymore. Things have kind of gone too far in one direction, and there needs to be some checks and balances on these businesses. As a matter of fact, after that coal mine strike in 1902, Roosevelt starts looking for good and bad corporations, ones that are kind of abusing the system, if you will. And if he does find that they're an abusive relationship, if they're giving poor working conditions, if they're giving poor produce, poor service to their customers, that the federal government's going to get involved, especially if they're involved in price fixing, artificially inflating their prices. And one of the first tests of this new dogma, if you will, this new way of kind of regulating businesses, is going to happen against one of the railroad companies, Northern Securities, kind of this conglomerate across the northern part of the United States, running from like the Great Lakes all the way out to the Pacific. This combination, this corporation, this trust that is created by J.P. Morgan and other industrialists really kind of has a monopoly in that region of the United States. And they quickly, once they build their trust, their railroad corporation, they quickly begin raising rates. Well, a lot of people start screaming, saying, hey, look, your rates are way outrageously high. We can't pay this. You need to lower them. Northern Securities, this new railroad company, doesn't care, keeps raising its rates. Those Americans that have to deal with this company start calling out for help, and they look to politicians to try and rein this company in. The President of the United States tells his Attorney General, Philander Knox, to go ahead and file suit against Northern Securities for being a bad corporation, for using bad laws, for treating its customers unfairly, and takes that company to court. And lo and behold, in 1904, the Supreme Court agrees with the U.S. government that this trust is illegal and that its business practices were illegal, and it's kind of seen as a green light by Roosevelt to go after all these other kind of businesses that are doing the same things. Companies like Standard Oil, American Tobacco Company, DuPont Chemical Company. A lot of these businesses had gotten so big that they were the only company in that particular industry now. Standard Oil controlled more than 90% of the oil market. American Tobacco, more than 90% of the tobacco companies, or the market. DuPont Chemical was virtually the only chemical company in the United States. So if you needed to buy fertilizer, if you needed to buy components to make paint, anything, you had to go through DuPont, which gave them incredible pricing control, meant they could gouge prices as much as they wanted to. Roosevelt and his administration said that stops now, and they started attacking these corporations, saying you have to break yourself up into smaller components, smaller pieces, if you will, so it's a more fair playing field, so that new competitors can come in and you can't squash them and drive them out of business through predatory pricing, right? And then inflate the market all over again and make more money. What Roosevelt told the American people is he wanted to give them a square deal. He didn't want to destroy all corporations. He just wanted to rein in the bad ones, let the good ones, the ones that were doing business the right way, let them keep doing what they were doing. But he definitely wanted to give everybody a chance. And as a matter of fact, his activities were incredibly popular with the American people. They finally felt that they had somebody that was on their side, that was making a change, the changes that they wanted to see. When he runs for re-election in 1904, he is overwhelmingly reelected. The Democratic opponent is just crushed. And Theodore Roosevelt sees that as a green light for more reforms. He starts pushing through more laws through Congress. Things like the Food and Drug Act that said that, hey, if you buy food, if you buy a drug that you think is going to help you or be safe, it should actually be safe for you. A lot of drugs at that time, elixirs that were supposed to make you better from a sickness, actually had poisons in them, things like arsenic or mercury, things that would actually kill you. Well, now the federal government said if you say that this is a healthy product, it actually has to be a healthy product. If you say this is food, it actually has to be food. It can't be sawdust or rat droppings or whatever it might be, right? It actually has to be what it's labeled. The federal government even says that they're going to inspect businesses to make sure they're doing the right thing. They passed the Meat Inspection Act also in 1906 that sends out federal employees to make sure these packing houses, these meat packers, actually are taking care of the meat and that it is safe to eat, that it's not going to kill you, right? That your meal isn't going to be the thing that kills you. And it's not just in reining in this economic abuses that have been going on in the past 20 or 30 years in the United States. A lot of these progressives, including Theodore Roosevelt, are also interested in the environment. They notice that a lot of these businesses, even individual Americans, are destroying a lot of the country, that a lot of the forests that used to exist in the Northeast were all gone now, that it is starting to happen out in the Midwest and West, that in a lot of places the beautiful parts of America were disappearing, being bought up and drained of all their resources. So a lot of Americans started saying we need to protect some of this stuff. And working with environmentalists like John Muir, who's shown down in these photos here and here, people like Theodore Roosevelt started saying let's protect these areas. Roosevelt leaves the White House, goes on tour across the United States, stops at various places like a Yellowstone, right? Bryce and Zion Canyons in Utah, even all the way out here to California and Yosemite Valley, and says these places need to be protected. Pushes through another piece of legislation, the American Antiquities Act, to make sure that the federal government can come in, buy all these lands, and hold them in the public trust so that they're there forever, right? So that everybody has access to them from generation to generation, to keep businesses from going in and destroying them, keep individuals from going in and destroying these places. It's incredibly popular. It becomes the backbone of the American park system that we still know and enjoy today. Without Theodore Roosevelt and this progressive agenda of kind of reining in business practices in the United States, who knows what places like Yosemite or Yellowstone would have looked like without this legislation. And he even goes farther than that. The 1902 Reclamation Act was pushed through Congress to allow federal funding of projects out west to harness water, things like the San Joaquin River. The reason that we have dams at Shaver Lake, at Huntington, Florence, and Edison is because of this law in 1902, which allowed some companies to come in and harness that water to produce not only power, but to provide water during the summers for farmers so they could continue to grow crops. Again, making these resources available not to just some, but to more people, right? To foster even more economic activity in the United States, but to also to level the playing field, to allow more people to take advantage of all these resources that were out here. So you can kind of see how this progressive agenda really worked, right? There are a lot of things were happening in the United States in a very short time. And it was also happening outside of government. While people like Theodore Roosevelt were great leaders, there were a number of upper class and middle class Americans that were getting involved in this movement, especially women. A lot of women were getting involved because they had the free time. Working class women had to go to work every day and then had to go home and help take care of their families. They just didn't have the time. They might have been interested in these issues, but they didn't have the free time to really dedicate to fixing a lot of these problems. Upper class and middle class women, because their husbands made enough money to support their families individually, did have this time. So they got involved. And one of the reasons they were listened to is because they weren't seen as really as dangerous or subversive. They weren't these immigrant people trying to reform American society. They were the wives of some of the most successful American businessmen, American politicians, and they wanted to just make the country a better place to live, a better place for their families to live, to make their cities a more healthy environment. Those aren't things that you can really disagree with when you really kind of stop and look at it. And especially coming from middle class and upper class women who are kind of seen as the moral agents for the household, right? The ones that kind of kept the family on a wholesome level, right? Kind of looked out for the well-being of the family. If the wife said, hey, we need a park here, we need a library here, the husband really couldn't argue with that. His wife's authority in that area was just too great. He'd have to kind of get on board with that agenda and say, yes, what can we do to make these things happen, right? And it's not just some middle class and upper class Americans that are doing this. It's a lot of them. Native Americans get organized, have their own organizations, blacks as well, kind of pushing for their agendas, the things that matter to them. Sometimes they would work together. Most of the times they're separate, but occasionally they would work together across the board for some of these reforms in American society. So you can kind of see this progressive movement is really kind of a juggernaut, if you will. Really has a lot of power and a very widespread kind of base to it. And it's not just in the United States. Most of the industrialized world, which is Western Europe, parts of South America and Central America, are also doing the same thing. A lot of progressives in those countries trying to reform this industrialization that's happened and make their places, their homes, a better place to live as well. And the reason is because a lot of these upper class and middle class men and women have a vested interest in a well-adjusted society. They can't really feel safe. They can't really feel that they have a long-term home with all this turmoil, with all these problems, with all these issues of things like labor movement strife that happens in the midst of their cities, like things like the Great Strike in 1877, where virtually the entire rail yard of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is destroyed in rioting between workers and government troops, right, during a strike period. Those are just too disruptive to American life. They just destroy too much property. And many upper class and middle class Americans just have too much invested in these different businesses that they often work for and that they derive their livelihood from. They need things to run smoother, so they want to fix a lot of these problems. And it's not just in economics. People like Jane Addams, who's shown down here in the lower right-hand corner, kind of towards the end of her life in the 1930s, is also interested in just making a more harmonious society. She sees a lot of immigrants coming to the United States, especially in her home city of Chicago, Illinois, that she knows that they need help, that they're being kind of abused by the system in some ways because they don't maybe speak the language, because they don't have awareness of what's going on culturally in the United States, that a lot of times they're kind of used for cheap labor or to do some activities that are maybe not entirely wholesome, right? A lot of immigrant women are forced into prostitution because they have no other way of making money. So she tries to give them another avenue. She creates a thing called a settlement house. In her case, she called it Hull House, after the name of a mansion that she bought in the inner city of Chicago. All the rich people of Chicago had fled to the suburbs, the outskirts of the city, leaving their old mansions behind. Well, she bought one of those, called it Hull House, after the name of the family that originally lived there, and started opening up her house for these immigrants that were flooding into Chicago during the 1890s, giving them a place to stay, place to live, child care for their families, giving them language lessons in English, trying to teach them American culture, but also allowing them a place where they could put on their own cultural pageants, if you will, to kind of preserve their language, their culture, to make sure that they didn't forget where they came from and who they were. So she was kind of trying to marry these two parts of American life. Native-born Americans who had been generations in the United States with these new Americans that were flooding in, trying to make sure that they kind of felt accepted, that they were a part of this mix, right? So you can see progressives were interested in a lot of different things during the early 1900s. As a matter of fact, Jane Addams is going to win the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts of trying to help the society grow and to kind of find a level of well-being, right? Kind of reducing some of this internal strife that existed in American society at the time. Quickly, however, progressives found that while they could do some individual acts, some things like a president pushing through a law, things like a Jane Addams taking on helping immigrants, then a lot of times, a lot of their efforts were stymied by political bosses, that political system that really allowed these kind of behind-the-scenes people to really kind of dictate everything that happened. A lot of times progressives would say, we want a playground for our kids to play in, a green space here in the city, or we want a library where our kids can go and read books, and it'd be available for everybody here in the city, including the poor, right? A way for them to improve themselves. Well, they'd vote for these things. They'd say they want these things, but then they wouldn't happen because the political bosses just didn't see any vested interest for them in it, right? There was no way for them to make money, or their political allies, their donors, these big corporations would say that that's not in our interest. We're not going to give you money for that. So they wouldn't happen. So that meant for a lot of progressives, they were going to have to get energized in politics. The only way they could get the playgrounds and libraries built that they wanted built, the only way they could fix American society, get rid of immoral issues like prostitution or like drinking too much, right, alcoholism, was to pass laws. And the only way they could pass those laws is if they controlled government. They had to get rid of these bosses and their corrupt friends in business and just American society, and even in sometimes illegal organizations. They started saying, we need to clean up government and fix it. And that's what they went about doing. They went out and got professionals' advice. They found candidates that represented their interests, people like Theodore Roosevelt, and voted for him and voted him into office. And if it looked like there was some kind of illegal activities going on, they filed lawsuits. They went out and challenged election results until they could prove that there was some kind of vote fixing going on, that there was some kind of cheating going on. And they got their people into office all through the early 1900s, even into the 1920s. And once they started gaining control of the political apparatus, a lot of the things they wanted to see done started getting done. Things like the 18th Amendment, prohibition, was passed at the kind of the end of the progressive movement in 1919. Even earlier than that, the 16th Amendment was passed, which said, hey, if you make a lot of money, you should have to pay a lot of taxes. A lot of progressives felt it was kind of unfair that Andrew Carnegie paid as much in taxes as any of his workers did when he had more wealth than all of his workers combined. So they said excessive wealth is bad. If you make more, you should pay more. So they created a thing called the graduated income tax and passed that amendment to the Constitution. They also passed a direct election of senators by popular vote. No longer would backroom deals be done to send political friends to Washington to be senators, and then those people would only pass laws that were good for themselves and their friends back home in business. Now voters would choose who was going to represent them, both nationally and locally. So you can see they're very, very successful, progressives are. They get a lot of things done. And what's kind of interesting, if you notice, that a lot of these ideas they pass aren't new ideas. They're things that those farmers have been calling for back in the 1890s, those farmers' alliances, the Grange movement, right? The Populist Party, the People's Party as it was called. These are things that they've been calling for 20, 30 years in some cases. Well, now middle class and upper class urban Americans agree that these are good things that need to be done. And once all segments of America start agreeing that these things need to be done, they get done. There's a huge consensus in the United States that these are good things that have to be done to make our country a better. And it's even farther than this, right? Work safety starts becoming a big issue. Things like the Triangle Fire in 1911, where more than 140 women are killed, either burned or jumping to their death out of an 8-story window, right? Progressives say, look, there's no reason these women should have had to die at work. You shouldn't go to work and expect to die that day. It should be exactly the opposite, right? You should go to work and expect not to be able to come home that night. So they start forcing companies by, taking control of the political apparatus. They start forcing companies to behave better, to start forcing laws on these companies to make them safer, to put things like fire escapes in, to make sure that the fire department has adequate equipment to put out a big high-story, 8-story fire, to make sure that women have an escape route, that you can't lock them in during their day. So you can see this progressive movement is really all over the place. It's really taking on a lot of these big issues in American society, and it's making an impact. It's actually getting things done. One of the ways they're going to do it is a process that is still alive here in California. During the progressive movement in 1911, progressives out here changed the California Constitution. They put in a thing called the Initiative and Reform Amendment to the Constitution that says that voters can put on their own laws because they were so fed up with their government in Sacramento not passing the laws that they wanted to see that they said, fine, those politicians are too corrupt to do what we want them to do. We'll pass the laws ourselves. We'll bypass Sacramento entirely. And they passed laws that said that they can put laws on the ballot and then choose to vote for those laws, up or down, whether they wanted them or not. And then it had to become law, effectively bypassing all these politicians that they saw as corrupt individuals or in the back pockets of businesses or special interests, if you will, in today's kind of parlance. And it's still a process that we use today. This year, almost every ballot, you're going to see some of these initiatives still being put on board, right? Still things that voters have to take advantage of or decide on. And this is very much a progressive issue, putting these things in the hands of the people. Right? Very much a part of what they were about, making these decisions for themselves after they got the appropriate advice from what you would call professionals in the industry or in that particular segment of interests. So progressivism was able to make big, deep, long-lasting impacts in American life. It was a very successful movement, and it lasted for almost 20 years when you really stop and look at it. All the way through World War I, the progressive era was still going strong, still kind of using government to fix problems. And that's one of the big things I want you to kind of get out of this particular chapter, is that progressives really saw government not as a thing to be ignored, but a thing to use, a tool that can make things better. That is a big change in American society in the progressive movement, is that now government is seen as a way to make things happen as opposed to just kind of an entity that's off on the side that just kind of is ignored and left alone. Now they see it as something for them to use to make their country a better. So kind of a recap here, right? The progressive era is really one of reform, of fixing these problems, especially for middle and upper class Americans, mainly women that are invested in these ideas of making the house, the home, the city that they live in a better place to live in. A lot of times their issues were drummed up, were kind of brought to their attention by journalists and intellectuals. They would kind of point out these problems in American society and then lend advice on how to fix it. Then these ideas would be picked up by these progressive reformers and then kind of pushed into action, either through social action, just through getting sheer numbers of people out to make a difference, to make a change, things like a Jane Addams and her Hull House to kind of fix these problems, or to go and pass laws and get politicians to do the things that they wanted to do. And it was very successful. It cleaned up politics, changed politics from being a place where it was kind of all backroom, kind of shady deals, to one that was much more above board, where election results actually mattered, and that you could actually figure out who was going to win by asking people who they were going to vote for, as opposed to in the past where it was just whatever the political bosses wanted. They were very successful in reforming American economic life as well. People like Theodore Roosevelt really did hamper in the power of these big giant trusts and corporations, these monopolies as they were called, breaking them up, returning some fairness, some level of an equal playing field to American economic life. And they pushed through a great variety of safety reforms, making it a better place to work in the United States, making it a less dangerous place to work in the United States. So not only did they make the workplace safer, but they actually made it more level, right? They actually started fixing these problems that have been going on for decades between business owners and their workers. A lot of people in the progressive era were just tired of getting caught in the middle between these strikes that would be caused by owners slashing pay and then workers refusing to take the pay cuts. They started forcing these two groups to kind of come to the table, start negotiating, start working things out. Business leaders could no longer just do whatever they wanted. They actually had to start kind of listening to other interests, especially these progressives. There are some limits, however, to what was going on in the United States at this time. One of the big areas that was kind of neglected by all this reform was in the area of really of kind of social class issues and racial issues. While there were a lot of Native Americans and African Americans involved in these reform movements, a lot of times they had to kind of work in their own sphere by themselves. White progressives didn't want to fix the issues of lynching, of Jim Crow laws. They didn't care about any of that. They didn't care about Native Americans losing out on their lands out west, of having their treaties abrogated and their lands taken by white settlers. None of that stuff really mattered to them. So there are some real limits here to what's happening in the Progressive Era. It was very much about what was happening to these middle class and upper class neighborhoods and the places and the cities that they found themselves in. Now, sometimes they did reach out to other groups like the Farmers Alliances and kind of worked with them to get some of these things through, but there were a lot of limits here. So this wasn't a perfect system. It wasn't a perfect moment, if you will, where everything got resolved. Only certain things got resolved, but it did show that changes could be made in the United States without huge upheavals, without throwing out the system and recreating a new one, that the system could be reformed and it could be made better and more responsive to the needs of the people that were running it, that were voting for it. So that's one of the kind of the big things to keep in mind as you kind of go through this. So thank you very much. Read the chapter, do the quiz, and let me know. All right?